Yeah.
Oh, now we're gonna record it all. Well, what do you think, Steve? Should we kind of start or wait another? Well, let's wait till another 2 minutes.
Yeah, that's fine. You can go ahead and kick it off. I have guests at the house and I'm gonna have to come in long enough to take attendance and I will go away again.
All right. Do you have somebody following an hour from now for general questions like they've done before?
Yes, we do have somebody at the end. Well,
Okay.
we do have a session at the end. I'm not sure that we have the person yet.
Okay. Was it just a general question session?
Yeah, there's a general Q and A session at the very end.
Are you do you run it yourself if nobody's there?
We haven't had that situation yet. I've always had somebody to volunteer to do it.
All right. If it ends up empty, I can stay. I went to Amazon and got my groceries already, so I'm good to go.
Well, that's not today though. It's out in
Oh,
June at the end of the
oh,
class.
okay. So we're just done. When we're done, we're done.
Yes.
We may well hit the hour because it's a lot of questions to go over. But as I said, I'm going to talk about the answer, the correct answer, not the multiple ones that are not correct. And a lot of the material says this isn't correct. Why? I'd rather say why it's correct. And it's very important because I'm going to present it that way. If something's not clear, ask on each question. Yeah, Vu, you're going to have to. I got an incredible audio loop. Yeah, it's working now. That's good. Well, 30 seconds, it'll be 5 after.
So Dan, it's probably okay to run over just a little bit.
Yeah.
We got Frank Hutchison coming up to talk about being a net control station.
Okay.
And if need be, we can have him start a little bit late. We're pretty flexible.
All right. And I'm even going to talk a bit about control versus licensee because it is not the same as it was years ago. The meanings are a bit abstract. The control is not, but all right. I think we've got enough. I'm going to go ahead and start. So as the group, I'm Dan, W7 Oscar Hotel. I'm in Seattle, and I think I know Vu is down in Orange County, and people are scattered around, but I think we'll just go ahead and start. I'm going to show some things you've already seen, but it's to refresh your memory. One is the band plan, because it's talked about. I'm not sharing yet. Let me bring this into the screen. I'm going to put all of you off on my right and make my working screen in the middle. Screen. Screen 3. So now you should be seeing my desktop basically, where you see an ARRL page, and ARRL is American Amateur It's the American Amateur Radio Relay League. It's an old organization, very important, and there's a lot of resources. And I'm on the particular talking about the band plan. You hear the term band plan, and sometimes you're going, well, is this about rock or what? And some people think it means FM radio, like in an older car, you have a radio with FM and AM. Those are modulations, not bands. They are different frequencies, but band plan is what we kind of live by. This is a table talking about frequency meters, how long the wavelength is. So like 160 meters is the 1.8 to 2 megahertz is for CW. 1.8 to 1.810 is for digital modes. Finding it down to where each part is within the 1.8 to 2 megahertz band, that is 160 meters. I'm just going to kind of scroll down. Can I grab and do this? I cannot. Off to scroll. And it's the band plan in a text file. And it means you can look at what it is and have some more clarity that you might not. Some are unique that have little channels that are specific 60 meters, specific frequencies, not a spread of them. But this is an important concept. The next thing to show is a band plan chart. There are a couple. This should show. Do you see a nice colorful band plan? Can somebody acknowledge? Just on the sofa, just wave if you're hearing it. You see the band plan? Well, this is one published by the ARRL. It's a typical one most people use. The colors are simply what you can do with it. And the red is like for CW and data. That's the continuous wave, which most people say Morse code. The green is explained here. It's for phone and image, and you can send pictures. A tiny little wigglies are for Morse code, CW only. And this band, they even label it 40 meters is 7 megahertz to 7.3. And if you want to think about this, when you hear band, there are questions talk about on a band or a frequency. What band is it? All you got to remember is I'm going to look at 30 meters. So if we took the number 300, which is the speed of light in meters in three times 10 to the, I forget decimals, but if we take 300 and divide it by the frequency, we'd get 30. So frequency times wavelength is the, frequency times wavelength will give you a 300. Anytime you want to know, like at 14 megahertz, what do you have to multiply it by to get 300? By 20. These are rough. These meters are not exact. Frequencies are exact, but it's important to remember that's what that represents. Then there's one more band plan that's presented differently that I think Yaesu makes. You see if it opens for me where I expected. Or ICOM makes this one, and it's the same thing. It shows what you can do on what frequency. And down here where 2 meters you'll operate, even there are particular things you can do. Now, one thing that's important, oh gosh, I didn't store it. There, depending on where you live, there are local amateur radio groups that are frequency coordinators for regions. I live in Seattle, so there's the Western Washington ARA, and they create the table of, they coordinate frequencies like for repeaters. So you don't set up a repeater on top of another repeater too close. And it's not regulated by the FCC. It's a voluntary amateurs that do the regional assignment of frequencies and detail the final band plan. These are guidelines. Let me close these tabs. And we'll jump in. Oh, part 97. Here's one more thing to show you. Constantly as you go through the test, you will see references to part 97. And you're going, well, what the heck is it? This is from the Federal Register under Title 47, Telecommunications. Part 97 is simply that which addresses amateur radio. And here are the subparts. You can see it goes through definitions, station license requirements, operators, applying for vanity, all this materials covered, and it's a long document. So very few people have ever read this in the sense of that, and I don't suggest you do, but you need to be aware of what Part 97 is. I'll just scroll down rapidly to an area, technical standards. It says what's authorized. These regions, by the way, ITU region, ITU 1, 2, 3, ITU is an international treaty or agreement, international telegraphic union. I'm going to misphrase it. I'd have to look it up right now, but we're in region 2. We actually are slightly in region 3. Most people don't even realize, like American Samoa's governed sort of by the United States. It works with ham radio. Your license you could use there. It happens to be in region 3, but almost everybody falls in region 2 for us, and it says what frequencies we can use. It's an important concept that there's this international thing, and it goes on and on with more material. Transmitting power standards. You can't exceed 1.5 kilowatts. You have to use minimum power. This is material, you have learned a lot of it already, and it just goes on and on. But I wanted you to know where it came from. Now I'm going to close some of this other material. I'll reopen if we need. So this is the syllabus that Jack over in Spokane created. I'm going to roll down. He has a bit of material addressing his creation of it, and his own material talks about taking the test. You've seen this. I know I presented this before. Standards. Think about this. I believe you probably have the syllabus. This is not a bad representation. There are other versions of it, but don't hesitate to go backwards and look at the material he presents. And here it gets on to each sub-element. We're doing T1 commission rules, 6 exam questions out of 6 groups. We're going to cover all those questions. So we'll start here. I'm going to make this a little smaller. So first question is, which of the following is part of the basis and purpose of amateur radio? And it comes down to advancing the skills in technical and communication phases of radio art. It's that simple. Think of it as it's to advance the skills in technical communication. Which your agency rules and enforces the rules for amateur radio service in the United States? It's the FCC. Golly, that's pretty clear. You might find other answers. It's not the ARRL. It's not, somebody else. It's the Federal Communication FCC Commission. Number 3, what FCC rules state regarding the use of phonetic alphabet for station identification in amateur radio? It is required when in contact with foreign stations. So phonetic alphabet, a keynote, it says a phonetic alphabet. One thing to note, though, is you're supposed to use English for all this type of thing. In your call sign, you're supposed to say in English. I don't hear any problems with it ever. And this is the standard phonetic alphabet. You will hear people saying, instead of saying A, B, C, and would be Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, people might say apple, baboon, and cinnamon. It's very confusing. People substitute words that sound interesting, in call signs especially, and it's much easier if you use the standard international phonetic alphabet. Overseas, even many hams will use contrived ones, and it's hard to understand. They'll say kilowatt instead of kilo, because you're thinking now they're talking their radio power. Use the standard phonetic alphabet. It's really much easier. How many operator primary station license grants may be held by any one person? Now, this is about amateur radio, not other radio systems. So I have a operator license for DMR, for GMRS. That is not what I'm talking about. I have that and a ham license. We're talking about how many operator primary station amateur radio license grants may be held to one person. That's one. You're going to get one. What proves the FCC issued your license? When you take your test and pass it, you'll know you are licensed when you go in the FCC database. It's the ULS, and whoever you take your test will show where you can get that. You'll find your call sign listed, your ham. It's that easy. Once you're ham, you can upgrade, and your upgrade will take effect immediately. But that initial license, you got to wait for it to show up in the database. Next one. What is the FCC Part 97 edition of a beacon? And that's an amateur radio station transmitting communication for the purposes of observing propagation or related experimental activities. So a beacon is, just remember this answer, it's transmitting communications for the purpose of observing propagation or related experimental activities. You might want to know, if you live in one place, you want to know how does it, how far can I hear? So you listen to a beacon further away, I can or can't hear it. Think of that. So it's for propagation and experimental activities. What FCC Part 97 definition of a space station? Easy. An amateur station located more than 50 kilometers above the Earth's surface. And that in 50 kilometers is only about 30 miles. For those who don't think, want to think miles, it's pretty low. So fundamentally, it's an orbit. That's about 300,000 feet. So it's pretty darn high. There's no airplane flying up there that we're aware of. When they get a space plane, it might be. It's going to be something in orbit. It'll be either the space station. We don't have a shuttle anymore. It can well be a orbiting satellite that does some relay, but that is a space station above 50 kilometers. Which of the following entities recommends transmit receive channels and other parameters for auxiliary and repeater stations. We just talked about that. A voluntary frequency coordinator recognized by local amateurs. They'll try and give you, you know, the FCC, the ARRL. It's what we talked about. It's the local amateurs on a voluntary basis, frequency coordinating. Who selects the frequency coordinator? Again, amateurs in the local or regional area. That's who does it. It's not the FCC or anybody else. It's those who live around you and are fellow hams. So I wouldn't participate in a coordinating group for New York City. I suppose it's possible, but that's not the intent. It lets us know our region, know our geographic issues. You know, we can know some hills where you can't get across. If we're in the prairie, we might have to, we can plan our frequencies differently. And you're also looking at how much power they put out. What is the Radio Amateur Civilian Service, the Civilian Emergency Services, RACES? And it is all of these. RACES is a radio service using amateur frequencies for emergency management or civil defense. It is also the same using amateur stations for emergency management or civil defense, and an emergency service using amateur operators certified by a civil defense organization as being enrolled in that. For example, I have participated a little bit with our ACS, and I forget what it stands for. It's in Seattle. We work technically for the city, and there are other groups, various names, depending on where you live, may name them. Some are truly certified, others, and I can go to the central building in Seattle, and there's a room there with a bunch of ham radios. And just to differentiate a phrase here, a radio service using amateur stations, that means it's not a commercial radio station, it's not an ambulance station on their frequencies. My amateur station would belong to me, but I'm using amateur frequencies. Station versus frequent and versus the person, we only get one license. We don't get a station license we paste on the wall for our radio itself, and one for us to carry. We have a license, and it serves both. And it used to be a little different. When is willful interference to other amateur radio stations permitted? You can't. That's an easy one. When it asks willful interference, it's like going out and beating the dog. It's against the law. Do not beat the dog, the cow, your neighbor, anything. No willful interference at no time. Then now you get to the part that's about frequency allocations, emissions, spectrum sharing. Spectrum meanings what part of those frequencies. It's the whole thing. Spectrum is like light comes in colors. We can move across the frequencies. Transmissions near the band edges, those bands had like 1.8 to 2.0 for 160 meter wavelength. If you get too close to it, our frequency, even though we tune right there, splatters across. And we got to be careful not to cross that boundary, even though we set inside, the stuff we send out may get out. It's like shouting too loud in a thin wall apartment. You don't want the sound to get next door. Contact in the space station, power output. So which of the following frequencies is available for phone operation by the technician, which is what you are? And it is 28.3 to 28.5. I'm going to show you this again. Here is, I'm going to get down to it right here. Novice and tech, you have this little area 20.0 to 28.5, and this yellow is the only single sideband HF frequency to differentiate from 2 meters and such that you can use. So they'll ask you that question. Remember this one, it's very important. Oh, I don't want to close that one. Just drag that away. Oh, I dragged everything away. I apologize. I may have killed my questions. Here we are. So, which amateurs may contact International Space Station on VHF, where that's typically around 2 meters? Any amateur holding a technician class or higher. That means you. Once you get your license, with the right radio, I can use this radio as a Kenwood. I need an antenna that will kind of concentrate my beam that has some gain. But I've talked through the space station to stations in Eastern Canada using little baby handheld via the space station. And the people on the station, most of the Americans are hams. They're simply requested, please do this. And some of them will occasionally pop up. They do more like coordinate with a teacher somewhere and do it. Which frequencies in the 6 meter amateur band? 52.525. And if you see the question, remember I mentioned actual wavelengths is 300 divided by the frequency. That it gives you 5.7 meters. And this is the other way to do it is take the 300, divide it by 6, and you'll get a number, you'll get about 50, you'll get 50, which is the only thing that's close to the answer they're looking for. So that's where understand how you establish wavelength versus frequency. And you need the 300 is the speed of light is associated with that. It'll make sense that way. Which amateur band includes 146.52 megahertz? Once you start playing with the radios, that's 2 meters. And because the 2 meter band's 144 to 148, we saw that on the band plan, and they even mentioned it. How many amateurs use the 219 to 220 megahertz band of the 1.25 meter? And it says fixed digital message forwarding in systems. And I'm going to go back and open that band plan that I'm frustrated with moving around. And if we look at 2 meters, here is that 219 to 220. And this chunklet is missing because the federal government sold it to UPS 15, 20 years ago, and they never used it. We used to have this bit, and but this is a special piece, fixed digital messaging forwarding systems only. I personally don't know anybody that's using it right now. On which HF bands, and that's high frequency, does a technician class operator have phone privileges? We just covered it. It was that 10 meter band only. Again, I'm going to hop over here on 10 meters. Here's your little, your area, 28 and to 28.5. And the yellow, that's your single sideband phone, meaning you have voice. Which of the following VHF, UHF band segments are limited to CW only? And it's 50 megahertz to 50.1 and 144 to 144.1. I'm going to pop back to the band pan. This is where you can't take this with you in your test. So if we look at the 50 megahertz, here's that little bit of CW only. And it's easy, 50 to 50.1. And the other one was on 2 meters right below it, 144 to 144 points. So it's the bottom of these two bands. But you won't find answers that look anything like this on the test. They're not trick questions where there's ambiguity. How are U.S. amateurs restricted in segments of the band where amateur radio service is secondary? Well, that has to do, U.S. amateurs, you could find non-amateur stations in those segments. You got to avoid interfering with them. And that's the key. When you hear something that's commercial traffic, don't transmit on top of it. Why should you not set your transmit frequency exactly at the edge of the amateur band or subband? We just talked about this. It's if you go right there, you may, the modulation sidebands could stick out the edge of the band. And if you had a calibration error, which things used to not be as precise as a lot of our modern radios, you may make a mistake and be outside the band. And frequencies drift on any radio. They're never perfect. So all of these are correct. That's the key to remember. You'll see that question and see this answer. All are correct. Where may single sideband phone be used in amateur bands above 50 megahertz? And the answer is in at least some segment of all these bands. Again, I'm going to pop up to here. And when you say above, 50, you see voice everywhere. Single side, and you can use single sideband or FM. You're not forced into this mode. I'll go back here. Does it say that? But you can use it in all of these, phone and image. What's the maximum peak power for technician class operators in the HF? That little area on 10 meters, you can have 200 watts. Most radios you buy today are 100-watt output without an amplifier if you're buying an HF radio, and that's the standard high power. There are a couple that are 200 watts, but without a big box like, well, you can't see my picture of this box down here. That can take me up to 1,500 watts about, but I only turn it on when I need it, and I actually start at lower power and only take it up to be heard. Except for some specific restrictions, what's the maximum peak envelope power output for technician class operators using frequencies above 30, and that's 1,500 watts. So again, this is going up into the higher bands. Band plan, it says above 30 megahertz, and they didn't say wavelength, but look where 30 megahertz is. You have to be above 10 meters, so generally it means 50 and all through up through here. You can use more. This you're limited to 200, remember? And I've never used really high power on those higher bands because they tend to be for more or less line of sight type activity. There's not a lot of reason to pump out high power on those. Now you get to licensing classes, the class of license, sequential vanity call sign systems, places where it's regulated by the FCC. I talked about that earlier before we started. Your name and address and forms, term, renewal, grace periods, maintaining mailing addresses, which should now say email addresses, international communications. So for which license classes are new licenses currently available from the FCC? Currently, we have 3. We have technician, general, and amateur. The reason I say there are 3, when I started, there were 5. There was a novice, then the technician, and we still have the general, and before the extra, there was an advanced. They dropped those 2. So now you only can get a new technician, general, or amateur, or upgrade between those. There still exist novices and advances who got those licenses before these changes occurred, and they can maintain them and renew them as they wish. The novice doesn't have a lot of privileges. In fact, at one time it lasted a year and would expire automatically, but it's gone entirely, but people can maintain it. So technician, general, extra. Who may select a desired call sign under the vanity call sign? Any licensed amateur. You will find out there are formats, like I'm W7 Oscar Hotel. Only an amateur can have what we refer to a 1x2, 1 letter, the region, the number, and 2 letters. And there are rules in that you can look up. You can get you'll get receive initially a 2x3, like KK7XXX, and you could get a vanity that would be a 1x3, which would be like my original call sign after I took my tech test was N7JLT. My first was like you would get. I had KB7BBG. And they're not issuing sequentially that 1x3, the N7JLT anymore. So there are a lot of vanities out there. People look for their initials, something meaningful to them. We have a gentleman here who's an electric car advocate, and he has one. His last three letters are GWG, and it stood for going without gas. They don't have to make sense to anybody but the owner of them. What types of international communications are an FCC licensed amateur radio station permitted to make? They have to be communications incidental to the purpose of the amateur radio service and remarks of personal character. Fundamentally, you can't do business. You don't call a friend that lives in Canada. You don't call a friend in the United States and say, hey, here's what I want you to go do is go order these stocks for me and, do this. You don't do business. It's personal. It can be technical. A lot of people discuss radios, what they're going to buy. well, you don't do business. That's personal. And you can talk, many groups have classes online, technical sessions, much like we're doing as a Zoom. It's of that nature, but this is the answer that they want. Communications incidental to the purpose of the amateur radio service and remarks of personal character. What may happen if the FCC is unable to reach you by email? They could revoke your station license or suspension of the operator license. Remember, these are the same thing. My license is on the wall somewhere, and that they're not separate licenses anymore. So this phrasing is kind of an antiquated thing, but they can take your license away. Which of the following is a valid technician class license? This is one where I sort of mentioned you're looking for a 2x3, 2 letters, 1 and then 3. The 1x3 is acceptable, but that's the only other format you can get right now. And on the test, they give you a list and none of them match except this one. And so you'll see KF7XXX. And from which of the following locations may an FCC licensed amateur radio station transmit? And this one, it's kind of obscure because they put in information, the other responses, but this one is from any vessel or craft located in international waters and documented or registered in the United States. And you are required to go to the ship captain and say, can I transmit? I violated that being in a local ferry boat here in Puget Sound. But in some like cruise I just went on, they don't allow ham radio to come on board. So I think you can get away with taking a handheld, but don't, because you never know who somebody interprets literally and takes it away. So on this one, it's about any vessel or craft in international waters and documented or registered in the U.S. Which of the following can result in revocation of station license or suspension of the operator license? Failure to provide and maintain a correct email address. Because remembering now they don't mail anything to you. You must have a U.S. address to get your license. You could live in the Philippines. And if you have family here or a U.S. address, you can apply for a license. You got to maintain the email address so they can communicate. They don't mail anything to you anymore. What's the normal term for the FCC issued amateur radio license? 10 years. Easy. Normal term for what is the grace period for renewal if an amateur license expires? It's 2 years. And one thing to think about, you will hear another number, 2 years and a day. Vanity licenses are not available until after they've expired or been canceled for 2 years and a day. But 2 years is when you have a grace period. If you forget to renew and you go, oh gosh, I didn't renew it, you can renew it within 2 years. But the moment it expires or cancel, you can't transmit until you renew. You can't say I have a grace period 2 years. I'll renew next year. I'm transmitting away. Illegal. If they caught you, they could cite you. How soon after passing examination of your first amateur radio license may you transmit on the amateur radio bands? We mentioned it. As soon as your license, operator station license grant appears in the FCC database. If your license has expired and is still within the allowable grace period, may you continue to transmit in amateur bands? We just discussed it. Nope, got to wait till it's renewed. You got to have it. It's like a driver's license. If it's expired, suspended, don't do it. So now here's the authorized and prohibited transmissions, communications with other countries, music, exchange of information with other services, indecent language, compensation for operating, retransmission of other amateur signals, encryption, sale of equipment, unidentified transmissions, one-way transmissions. This is a handful to understand. You will hear hams arguing about parts of it. And we'll touch that. We might even pull up part 97. With which countries are FCC licensed amateur radio stations prohibited from exchanging communications? And that's any country whose administrations told the International Telecommunication Union, the ITU, that objects to such. Note here, Yemen, North Korea don't allow it. Most of the world allows it. There are countries it's difficult to get a license in, for the person who lives there, but you're not prohibited to contacting them. Under which following circumstances are one-way transmissions by amateur radio prohibited? You can't broadcast. Broadcasting is what commercial stations do. You turn on the TV, they broadcast it to you. It's not over. Now we're used to doing it through the internet. They're not even broadcasting. Technically, do they have to be licensed? Probably not. But if they put it over radio waves, they're broadcasting. It's for people to just listen to. You turn on the radio, and I listen for classical radio or jazz or whatever. That's broadcasting, where they spit it out and hope somebody listens. So it's an electronic transmission of radio and television signals intended for the general public reception, as distinguished from private signals that are directed to specific receivers. This phrasing even here gets a little gray, because maybe we have a tech session on a repeater where we're discussing technology. We might be really talking to more than one, and that's the thing, it's receivers, not receiver. And private signals, well, you're transmitting it, but anybody can listen to it. There's no, you don't encode things or make it secret. So the next minute is about that. When is it permissible to transmit messages encoded to obscure their meaning? And encoded, we could think of not just encoded, but encrypted, code where we're trying to hide something. Only when transmitting control commands to space stations or radio control craft. It's the only time. You can't obscure meaning deliberately. We have digital modes where if you just listen with the wrong radio and don't have the right technology, you can't hear it, but we don't encrypt. The police, for example, many places encrypt their radios, so even with a scanner, you can't hear it. I can have a scanner that hears digital modes that I wouldn't listen to with a normal handheld, even in the same frequency, but it's not encrypted. The police encrypt it, so you can't hear what they're saying. Under what conditions is an amateur station authorized to transmit music using phone emission? A phone emission means things you would talk on. When incidental to authorized retransmission of manned spacecraft communication. It's an odd one. Basically, you can't transmit music. When may radio operators use their stations to notify other operators of availability of equipment to sell or trade? When selling it, not on a regular basis. If you run a ham radio store, you can't sell stuff over the air. That's doing business. I might say, gee, I have too many handhelds behind me. I do. I might tell somebody, hey, you want it? Hey, I'll give it you $50 or $20. That's really incidental. It's not a regular basis. And that's between ham radios. I suppose I could sell it to a new ham, but it's got to be licensed before I can talk in the air. What, if any, are the restrictions concerning transmission of language that may be considered indecent or obscene? Any such language prohibited? Very subjective. Just remember the answer is any such language is prohibited. So indecent, obscene is to some in the ear of the person listening and the person talking. Just don't be horrible on the radio. So it's prohibited. What types of amateur stations can automatically retrans signals of other amateur stations? And these are the repeater, auxiliary, or space stations. And you've talked about repeaters. When we have a big mountain here and we put somebody on top, we might be on one side of the mountain, transmit that on one frequency, they rebroadcast it so people on the other side can hear me. That's a repeater. Auxiliary and space stations come down to similar things. International Space Station quite literally has a repeater on it that's maintained. Occasionally they change the modality of it and to transmit pictures that you can receive, but often you can talk through it. In which of the following circumstances may the control operator of an amateur station receive compensation for operating it? As they say, you're teaching a class at an educational institute when communication is incidental to classroom instruction. So I could be teaching a class perhaps on amateur radio at a school and being paid as a teacher. Then That'd be about it. You can't get paid. It's like being a private pilot. You can't pay me to fly you. If I have a boat, you can't pay me to operate it. They even get down Coast Guard. You can't get paid for the gas even. So amateur radio is much the same as those services. You can't get paid for running a radio. Many of us volunteer for events, whether it's a marathon or some big event. They want people with handhelds scattered around to communicate back. That's a very popular thing to do. It's much like these races, but it can be a smaller, more specific to an event. How does the FCC define broadcasting for the radio amateur service? I think we covered it. Transmissions intended for reception by the general public. When may amateur radio station transmit without identifying on the air? And it's when transmitting signals control model craft. And the model craft meant RC airplanes and boats. It used to be popular for some hams to use ham radio frequencies for little joystick controllers. It's very rare now because the technologies have shifted to what's called spread spectrum, and you don't have to worry about being an exact channel and interfering with somebody else. So it's unusual now for people to use that, but you never identify. You're just transmitting, and that's exists still, but is unusual. Control operator eligibility, designating privileges, duties, location required, control point, control types, automatic. So we're going to go here. When may an amateur station transmit it without a control operator? Never. But one way to view it is, if I'm talking, I'm the control operator. If I'm transmitting, I'm the control operator. So if I'm using it, I'm the control operator. Who may be the control operator of station communicating through amateur satellite or space station? If you're licensed to transmit on the frequency that goes up to the satellite, you can be you'll be the control operator. Who must designate the station control operator? The station licensee. That's where I said there's two things. There's the station licensee, and there's this, and that's you. But if my friend sits here at my radios behind me, he can just say he's he. My station doesn't have a literal license. It truly used to be two separate pieces of paper in the past at one time. And the phrasing is sort of odd, but just remember the station licensee who owns it. What determines transmitting frequency privileges of the amateur station? Here's the one that's the kicker. If you came to my house and you say, sure, you can operate my stuff, you're designated, you can, and you're a technician, you could only operate within the technician band. So 2 meters and that little 70 centimeter, the higher frequencies, and that little sliver of 10 meters. So, it's the operator class that's the person, the control operator. The control is the one talking. What is the amateur station's control point? That's the location at which the control operator function is performed. An example of this, to make it clear, our local group here in Puget Sound has put up a transmitter across the other side of Puget Sound. If you're down in the Bay Area, or imagine in Orange County, somebody put a transmitter in Catalina Island, and you could control it remotely. We have a station where the radio station's in one place. I could go online and control it from my house, or Steve could be in Vancouver and control it from his home. It's where he would be the control operator if he was doing it in Vancouver. He's not physically where the radio is, but he controls the radio. So it's the location where the controller function is performed, and that can move around depending on who's logged in. When, under normal circumstances, may technician licensee be the control operator of station operating in an amateur extra band class? Easy. We said you can operate only within your class at no time. When the control operator is not the station licensee, who is responsible for the operation of the station? Guess what? It's both. If I own this stuff, you're not supposed to break the rules. But if you're the one breaking your rules, operating at your control, so both the operator and the licensee. Which of the following is an example of automatic control? Repeaters. So a repeater sits on top of the hill, rebroadcasts, and it is automatically transmit a signal on another frequency. So that's a repeater operation. Which of the following are required for remote control operation? I just mentioned it. The operator running it's going to be the control point. You have to have a control operator required at all times. When transmitting, you could think of it. You're going to say, well, what if nobody's transmitting? Nobody has to be doing anything. It's not emitting. It's just turned on. But to transmit, and that's the operating key, there's got to be an operator. The control operator must indirectly manipulate controls. Well, that's by definition a remote station. So all of these choices are correct. Which of the following is example of remote control as defined by Part 97? We just talked all about it, operating the station over the internet. Who does the FCC presume to be the control operator of an amateur station, unless documented to the contrary? Unless documentation to the contrary is in the station records, the station licensee. They assume if they hear my radio, it's me talking. And station records, by the way, you have to keep your license posted. Some people maintain a log of everything they say. It's not required. It's kind of surprising. Station identification repeaters, third-party communications, club stations, FCC inspection. So this is the last segment, and we're actually going to be just a little early. It's great, took longer than I thought. When must the station and its records be available for FCC inspection? At any time upon request by an FCC representative. Well, it's entirely true. Again, the records, there's no specific requirement for records other than keeping your license posted at your station, and you should keep a copy in your wallet. And you'll learn, or you may have learned already, how you get copies. They don't mail you anything, but make a copy and put it in your wallet. Most of them come with a larger one to put on the wall and a wallet size card when you cut out, and probably laminate so it'll persist. I have never heard of them coming to see anybody locally. They have done it with people that are clearly violating power restrictions, doing things that are wrong. Normally they'd notify you. So they're not hardcore, and they're voluntary groups helping monitor how people are behaving. I think the most common mistake would be faking a license, having an expired license, not realizing, and you'd get notified. But anytime they say, I want to see it, you got to show them. How must you identify with your FCC assigned call sign when using tactical call signs such as race headquarters, or it could be the pool guard, the mountain view, because you might imagine you having a foot race up a mountain and down. You might have the viewpoint, the water, the river crossing, which would be easy if a group's communicating to each other, so they know it's where it is as opposed to who. At the end of each communication or every 10 minutes during communication. That's the rule all the time. And a communication doesn't mean if I say, hey, Steve, how's the weather? W7OH. And then he'd say his, that wouldn't be it. It'd be, Steve, how's the weather? He'd say, it's raining cats and dogs. I'd say, oh, it's sunny here. I'm sad for you. We'd talk for 4 or 5 minutes. And at the end, when we're done talking, we would then identify ourselves. I'd say W7OH. He would give his call sign. So within 10 minutes, you must identify every 10 minutes, regardless if you talk for an hour. And if you talk for 3 or 4 minutes and you're done talking, identify. And it's safer to identify more often, not too often. And I tend to say W7 Oscar Hotel. Some people rush their call signs and I can't hear them. If I say phonetic, the full thing would be Whiskey 7 Oscar Hotel. I don't go W7OH. It's hard to hear. Slow speech down and people hear your call sign better. When you're required to transmit your assigned call sign, we just said it, every 10 minutes in the communication. What language may you use when operating in a phone subband? English. And that's identification. there, if you're, VU, if your team, I kind of assuming you might be Vietnamese. If you are, you can speak Vietnamese all the time. And then when you identify, you give your call sign as KK7XXX, whatever your call sign is. Your communication can be in a foreign language, but your call sign is supposed to be in English. What method of call sign identification required for a station transmitting phone? Remember, phone means voice signals. Send a call sign using CW, Morse code, in other words, or phone emission. So you can, you'll hear repeaters going, identifying with a Morse code automatically, typically, or you can say your call sign, either one. On most voice things, you hear people speak it. Which of the following self-assigned indicators are acceptable when using a phone transmission? And this is, if I go to Canada, and these are self-assigned, the W is out of context here. But if you're KL7CC, you go stroke W3 or slant W3 or slash W3. Stroke slash are the angle thing on your keyboard. And an example of this is if you get your technician license and you then take your general test and pass it, you can't operate in that. You can operate once you have your technician license and your call sign and you take the general, you could operate and pass the general, you can operate immediately on those general areas and the frequencies. But until it's in the FCC database, you would go stroke or slash or slant. You say stroke AG for acting general. So there are amendments. If I go to Canada as a technician, you could go to Canada, say your call sign slash VE, which would indicate it's in Canada. So there are a number of reasons to use this. All of these are correct. Stroke, slash, all correct. You'll hear arguments. Somebody likes one and not the other, but they're correct. Which of the following restrictions apply when a non-licensed person is allowed to speak to a foreign station using a station under the control of a licensed amateur operator? This is a big deal. The foreign station must be in a country with which the U.S. has a third-party agreement. Third party meaning sharing information for or directly by somebody else. And in other words, here in the U.S., if VU has, I don't know if VU has kids, but if VU gets a license and his kids want to talk on the radio while VU's talking, he can let them say, hi, I'm whatever my name is, have a nice day. He can continue. That's third party, and that's allowed. We could not do it if I'm talking to a country that does not allow that. And you can't send, this third party means messages that are from another, behalf of another person. What type of amateur radio station simultaneously retransmits the signal of another amateur station on a different channel or channels? Repeater station. And this gets more complicated. It's not mentioned. There are internet connectivity, and some of these are through ham radio modalities that are over radio frequencies, where I can connect repeaters from here into Montana, 800 miles away. The repeaters only go a short way, but I can connect where I'm talking on all of them. California, down where VU is, you have similar things. I forgot the name of the group. We even have interconnected repeaters. So you're talking and you're talking in many places. We have that when people check in from around the world and some of the internet best protocols on our repeater. So, but a repeater retransmits on a different channel or channels, and that you could substitute frequency or frequencies. Who is accountable if a repeater inadvertently retransmits communications, violates FCC rules? It's the control operator of the originating station. So that protects the person who owns the repeater. It is licensed under somebody's call sign. It's belongs to an individual. But the person saying the bad things or breaking the rules is the one pressing the key and talking. It's not the owner of the repeater. Which of the following requirements for issuance of a club station license grant? A club is just what it sounds like. You have to have at least 4 members, and those can be very special call signs. We're into T2, so we're through these questions with a few minutes to spare. I'm going to stop sharing and ask, does anybody have questions at this point? Speak up. Anything from anybody?